was the rush among some same-sex couples to marry before current president took office. Okay, so my time is up. And on the other hand, I'm just gonna say, skip a short part. So on the other hand, Japan, it's, as Ramsire put it, it's a second best justice. It's designed only to make do. It doesn't aim for perfection, but sometimes it produces a better result. However, like in Japan, it faced a dilemma that how many discriminate children, how many discriminate couples should have their human rights denied in court to justify intervention. Despite all instability, an unstable right is better than no right at all. So it's not much of a conclusion, but I guess that the most important challenge we are facing today is finding a middle way for justice somewhere between the Brazilian and Japanese models. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Professor Machado, for your very insightful exposition. Now I want to announce Professor Watanabe for his position.
Because, because of my poor English, I will try to read my speech. The title of my speech is Brazil and the Cultural Diversity, some current topics in the Brazil and Japan relationship. My presentation will be very brief and superficial, as I am not an expert on the panel's team. I will therefore discuss some topics that I consider to be relevant, that I have had some experience on. In the law area, cultural diversity may raise several matters, whether in relation to the cultural characteristics of a country, the formation of its legal system, or the dynamics of the relationship with the other countries and their legal system. Brazil is a relatively new country with a history just over 500 years. It has mixed population, formed initially by the indigenous people who were already living here for many centuries, and by inhabitants coming from Portugal, the country that it discovered, and they began to colonize it. Later added by African brought into the country as slaves. In addition, that initial core group, immigrants came from several other countries, mostly from Europe and to a lesser extent Asian countries, including Japan. With this historic blend of cultures throughout its history, a mixed race population was formed, and with a rich culture composed from elements of various origins. This having given rise to the special feature of our society, which is social plasticity and a great capacity of cultural integration. In the legal area, the current country's legal system was initially the Portuguese law, and was slowly shaping the Brazilian law after the independence in 1822, and at the event of Republic Proclamation in 1889, received strong influence of the U.S. law during the drafting of its new constitution, in the federative model conception, the federal Supreme Court attributions, and the sole jurisdiction system without an administrative justice. And throughout its history, there have been influence from other legal systems in the areas of civil law, civil procedural law, consumer protection, and the various other areas. In this regard, in partnership with the late and the Honorable Professor Ada Pellegrini Grenoble, I had the opportunity to enumerate the many influences received by our country from other legal models in the article Brazil and its European Influence, published in Janet Wilder and Oscar Chase, Common Law, Civil Law, and the Future of the Categories. In the Brazil-Japan relationship, reciprocal influence are few, although culturally it is quite significant, mainly due to the active participation of Japanese immigrants in Brazil since the year of 1980, by the active contribution of the Japanese culture to the formation of the Brazilian culture. Just to exemplify, I would mention judo in sports, which has become a national sport, the Japanese cuisine, the cooperativism in social organization, karaoke in the recreation, and many other contributions which were exotic until some time ago and today are part of the Brazilian culture. In the legal area, we received an important influence from Japanese law in the area of judicial conciliation, with the participation of members of the civil society. Brazil, which had always adopted the conciliation model done by the judge, at best by a person appointed or elected for that purpose, such as a justice of peace, began to adopt, as from 1980, upon the drafting of the smuggling court law, the Japanese model of conciliation promoted by the conciliators recruited into the society. And that is the model currently in force in Brazil, both in Resolution 125 of National Council of Justice, as well as in the new Civil Procedure Code of 2015, and also in the mediation law number 13,140 from 2015. The influence of Brazil law in the formulation of a Japanese procedural model for consumer protection occurred recently by the acting of Professor Koichi Mori from Keio University, who adopted as a model the Brazilian class action system to protect collectively consumer individual interests. This was certainly the first time Japan has evaluated the Brazilian law as of sufficient excellence to have it as the model of its legislation, what is highly honorable and encouraging for fact in terms of comparative law. Finally, in this short time remaining, I would like to talk about a legal problem that exists in the Brazil-Japan relationship. It is the need for an international legal cooperation treaty, including the civil and the criminal areas. This was recently evidenced by the judgment in Brazil of crimes committed in Japan for Brazilians who, following the practice of criminal acts, returned to Brazil without facing responsibility before the Japanese justice system. Initially, Japan started requesting that the accused individuals be extradited to tried by its justice system. However, in view of prohibition in the Brazilian constitution for the extradition of nationals, except for on naturalized as a Brazilian citizen for a crime committed before her naturalization, or for approving involvement in the trafficking of narcotics and related drugs, the Brazilian government could not comply with the Japanese government request. As a result, we were left with the resolution of judgment of those crimes in Brazil, with the application of the principle of extraterritoriality of the Brazilian criminal law under the terms of Article 7 of the Penal Code. That was the resolution presented by a commission appointed by Brasil-Japão Institute of Comparative Law, comprised of numerous Brazilian jurists. The commission, taking into consideration the absence of a treaty between Brazil and Japan, governing the gathering of evidence and the other important aspects of the formation of civil and criminal proceedings, drafted a judicial cooperation treaty suggestions that, after discussions in Brazil and Japan by Brazilian and Japanese jurists, was presented to Brazilian and Japanese authorities in 2007. Nevertheless, so far, after 12 years, we have no indication the treaty will be entered into. 4 or 5 Brazilians who have committed crimes in Japan have already been tried, judged, and convicted in Brazil. However, with the difficulties deriving from the lack of treaty between the two countries, leading to very long delays in the fulfillment of letters rogatory for collecting evidence in Japan, even at risk of the lapsing of the statute of limitation of the respective crimes. Without a treaty, letters rogatory are processed through diplomatic channel, subjecting them to an excessive bureaucratic and lengthy procedure. The treaty, with the creation a central authority for receiving and transmitting requests for cooperation, would greatly expedite the gathering of evidence and the other acts. To conclude my quick participation, I would like to stress the urgent signing the International Judicial Cooperation Treaty between Brazil and Japan, both in the civil and criminal areas. According to data recently provided by the Brazilian Embassy in Japan, it is large the number of the letters rogatory sent by the Brazilian justice system to the Japanese justice system, predominantly in family law matters, but also covering other areas, including the criminal one. Those are my quick thoughts on the theme of cultural diversity and the global challenge. Thank you very much.
Professor Watanabe is himself a part of the relation of Brazilian and Japanese people. Thanks, Professor Watanabe, for your nice exposition. I would like to consult the organized committee if you have time for some debate or no. 5 minutes. I think you have 5 minutes if somebody wants to make a question. Oh, I really I have a question for Professor Machado. How really is the role of the women in Japanese family? She do you think it is changing or it's uh, yet a very conservative place that the woman occupies in Japanese family? Could you answer that? I think.
Sure. I'm not sure if I can talk for everyone, but I think it's still very conservative. It's changing. The ideal is changing, and I think it's the same thing in Brazil. The ideal has changed, but yet, like in most cases, men don't do housework, and women do most of the work at home. And the same thing happens in Japan. And so the ideal is changing, and there are some institutional changes too, like trying to uh, change, really change it. But yet, there is a much of work to do, like to change it. But it's still like very conservative.
I've heard that some young Japanese women are not marrying just to could have a profession because in traditional family they occupy a household. Is that true?
Uh, you mean they don't marry because to have a job? Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to work. Um, ac- uh, what I hear most is that I'm not the most qualified person to talk about labor law, but what I hear most is that first people get married, and then after they have children, it's not about marriage, it's about having children. And in Japan, marriage is still very connected to having children. People get married to have children or because they are going to have a child. So, and when they have a child, usually women quit their job. They're trying to change it, but still very slow. So, like, there's a graph, M graph. Like, I don't know if it's already actual, but the idea is that the women, if they're married, they quit their job for a while, and when they try to get back to work, they can't get the same position they had, and then they like get into lower positions, and it's structural.
Okay, thanks, Professor Machado. I think now you can finish. I would like to thank all the expositors, and I think you begin the other panel.
Uh, it's done. Yeah.
Working? Okay. I think we have about 5 or 7 minutes more. We have a short coffee break here. If you want to go, we have 10 minutes to listen punctually. Just in time, we're going to have the next section will be
Session
10,
5 minutes, 30.
10:30, right?
10:30. Yeah.
10:30.
5 minutes.
Okay.
Are you Brazilian?
Eu sou brasileiro. Só que eu tô no Japão há 11 anos. Tô reaprendendo português.
Radicado lá não, você volta em.
Muito obrigado.
Desculpa qualquer
Imagina, eu
coisa.
tive que sair algumas vezes, mas eu acho que eu peguei o mais importante.
Não,
for qualquer.
Não,
efetivo
muito
da Suprema
interessante,
Corte.
muito interessante.
Não, muito bacana.
Eu sou mestre de cerimônia também, eu tenho que falar.
Ah, é.
Ei, Bel. Você viu isso do mestre de cerimônia? Já estava na apresentação. Meu desastre de mestre de cerimônia.
So we can benefit from this short break. And
Parabéns pela organização. Você me deixou muito
imagina, cara.
segunda-feira eu vim cedo, por acaso eu tenho aula de 5h30 e amanhã eu tenho sessão, então recebo advogado, professor. Eu gostaria a tarde inteira, mas parabéns, parabéns.
Nós estamos um pouco a bit awkward because a couple arrangements.
Pode falar em português. Volta para a minha performance.
Tem um cafezinho aqui.
Eu vou ter Nós estamos a beat o quê, você falou?
Tá meio atrapalhada a coisa aqui, porque
A session 2. Eu assumo o timing, vou parar aqui com Freitas. E só uma pergunta, esses múltiplos sessions aí das 2 horas são várias salas? Vocês anunciam?
Samara já estão. É isso aqui que a gente vai ver. Eu vou falar com.
Dia, vou me despedir. It's an honor to be like your teacher. I miss you a lot, but we can't write so much in the emails. Otherwise, I would like to exchange emails every week with you. Whenever we have a regular program review, I always think about you. I still read Japan Times in English. It's an English speaking newspaper. They
presentation is already? No, that's it?
Yes.
Not sure. Professor Araki, your presentation, my presentation is not.
Tá na área de trabalho?
Yes.
Ok. Yuri que preparou.
Yeah.
Melhor eu chamar ela.
But no, it's okay.
Diminui, peraí. Diminui o dele. Quem fala primeiro, ele ou você?
Okay, it's okay. It's working.
Deixa eu te falar. Na mesa do Yuri, tá montando uma apresentação.
Tá.
Ele vai fazer uma apresentação.
Tá. Pode ser.
Vamos subir o que acaba.
Entendi. Ele fica de chairman numa e de apresentador na outra. Fica bom. Pode ser.
Porque você também tá apresentando em duas.
Isso. Estou a postos.
Esse aqui é o seu ou é o meu?
É meu esse.
Tá, então deixa eu ver o meu aqui. Um pouquinho pra cá.
Tá. Mas como chairman você não quer que eu fique no meio? Não tem
Quero,
problema.
quero sim.
Então.
Depois eu vou por aí, a gente change the seat.
I will use
Yes.
the computer so I sit here.
Yes. Ele é o primeiro. Sim, mas ele é o primeiro.
Então, esse aqui tá em São Paulo. Tá em São Paulo, então melhor você.
Você quer que eu peça ajuda pra Yuri pra anunciar as salas no final? Ela me passa o bilhete.
O Daniel fala isso com ela.
Tá. Depois,
Se você fazer um slide.
ao final desse painel, avisar quais são as salas das 14 horas para as pessoas já saberem canalizar.
Eu vou avisar, eu vou avisar para cada grupo, eu vou falar todos os participantes.
São os previamente inscritos. São quantos?
O grupo 1 é tal sala,
Tá.
o grupo 2 em tal sala.
Tá, você pega o microfone, eu te passo,
Eu tenho esse microfone aqui.
eu te chamo ao final do painel e falo, a Daniel tem uns avisos a fazer.
Sim, pode ser.
Pode ser? Peraí, vamos empurrar mais uma cadeira
Você quer
pra ficar vazio.
eu abro agora ou você?
Eu abro aqui.
Preciso fazer dois announcements. Um de que nós estamos no FD USP Espaço Audiovisual,
Uhum.
no streaming, no YouTube, e que after the last session of this night, this afternoon, we're gonna have the second concert in the USP.
Eu faço a palavra para você do screening? Não sei. Não sei se eles quiserem. Good morning. Good morning, everybody. Let's start the section 2. General overview of the labor law reform. I'm very glad to be here, very honored to be here. Professor Araki was very kind when we went to Tokyo University last year. It's an honor to have you here at University of São Paulo. Thank you very much, Professor Araki, for having traveling so many hours being here. Is there a telephone ringing here? Yes? Someone left the telephone. And thank you again, Professor Freitas, and for this such an important event here at the University of São Paulo. First, we have two announcements. The first one, I think most of the audience know already. At 6 p.m., we are going to have here a very special concert from our most important orchestra in Brazil, OSESP, Orquestra Sinfônica do Estado de São Paulo, São Paulo Symphony Orchestra. It's an honor to have them here. They will be here 3 times this semester, so I really invite you to join us here at the most important room here in this college. And we are going to have a concert from 6 to 7, more or less. And the second announcement, Freitas will refresh my memory. We are live here. We are live in a special transmission from the internet. So I'd like you to highlight this.
Yes, just to reinforce the fact that we have a streaming by the YouTube, and the address is FD USP space audiovisual, and this will be also recorded, and you can use this material afterwards. So
Thank you, Freitas. So we start now the second session, the general overview of the labor law reform. Labor law reform, I told Professor Araki, the never-ending labor law reform, because we don't know exactly which labor law reform we are talking. In Brazil, normally we say the 2017 labor law reform. In Japan, normally say 2018 labor law reform, at least as a reference. I'm very glad to have you here, as I said. I don't know if the audience is aware that Tokyo University has 5 Nobel Prizes. It's an honor. It's a very important university, more than 100 years, and we had a very warm um, time there last year. So, Professor Araki, I would like to invite you to present us with this speech. I think 20 minutes, no, 40 minutes. 40 minutes and then 25 minutes to Freitas, yes? And he will talk about background and features of the work style reform in Japan. Thank you, Professor Araki.
Thank you, Professor Umaira, for your very kind introduction. I'm Takashi Araki from Tokyo University. It's my great honor and privilege to be here again. Actually, I was here in 2010. I was invited by Professor Masato Ninomiya, and we gave a presentation. I gave a presentation with Professor Akio Shimamura. Akio made a wonderful presentation in Portuguese, but unfortunately I couldn't. The only word I know is obrigado. So I made my presentation in English, and in Japanese, and my talk was translated by Professor Ninomiya. Professor Ninomiya usually translates emperor's family's conversation, but I was, uh, I'm so grateful for Professor Ninomiya to translate my poor Japanese intervention into beautiful Portuguese. And on this occasion, I'd like to thank Professor Ninomiya for his contribution to strengthen the ties between Brazil and Japan, especially in the legal community. And this is the second seminar between Brazil and Japan. And I'm very grateful that Professor Nomiya had a wonderful successor for his legacy, Akio. So I'm very happy to join this seminar again. So this is the outline. First, I will explain the Japanese employment system. And we have two problems. The first one is long working hours among employees. And second problem is unreasonable gap between standard and non-standard employees. But the detail of this new reform will be explained by my colleague, Professor Ikeda and Professor Konishi in this afternoon session. So I'd like to give us general backgrounds of this reform. And I'll point out some features of this work style reform we had last year. First, let's look at the unemployment rate. Japan is very famous for lifetime employment or long-term employment. Thanks to this practice respecting employment security, Japan still maintains very, very low unemployment rate. Currently, only 2.4% are unemployed. This time I researched the situation in Brazil, and I'm so shocked. From 2014, you have a skyrocketing increase in unemployment in Brazil. So I'd like to know the reason why later. And long-term employment also affected the characteristics of collective industrial relationship. Long-term employment means repeated gain in the economic term. In the repeated gain, the most rational attitude is not to betray the other parties, but to establish a trustworthy relationship with each other. If you betray the other party, you'll be revenged at the next occasion to have a contract. So if you have a long-term employment relationship, for both parties, the most rational attitude is to establish a trust between each other. So this reflects to the collective labor relationship in Japan. Until the mid-1970s, we have so many strikes. But between this very confrontational relationship, both labor and management learned this kind of antagonistic relationship will not beneficial for both parties. So they switch to the model from the antagonistic relationship to more cooperative industrial relations. So recently we have very, very few number of strikes, almost zero. By contrast, we have an increase in individual labor disputes. In 1990, the total litigation filed to the first instance was only 1,000 cases all over Japan. And this was tripled in 2002. We have more than 3,000 cases, so tripled. So Japan introduced a new system called labor tribunal system. This is a kind of Japanese version of labor court. In this labor tribunal system, we have a tripartite bench. In the center, professional judge will sit, and side we have a representative of labor side and management side. So it is a tripartite bench. And the most important feature is this process is very, very speedy. Too close? Okay. Yeah.
He will change.
Okay. And so,
Some noises.
okay. Thank you. So this process will end within 3 sessions. So the average number of the days which in this labor tribunal system will around 70 days. So all cases must be handled within 3 sessions. That means 2 months and a half or something. So ordinary labor litigation, labor lawsuits at the ordinary course last about 14 months. So compared to the ordinary case litigation, this labor tribunal's case is much expedited. So this new labor tribunal system introduced in 2006. Then this part here. So we have on the same number of ordinary litigation. So currently we have around 7 to 8,000 cases all over Japan. But Brazil, you have 2 or 3 million cases, so the situation is totally different. Okay, for the sake of time, let me skip, but just a few words. When we compare the employment system, United States is a champion of flexibility, flexible adjustment of the workforce, and flexible modification working conditions. It's very easy for the American employers. So very rich in flexibility in the United States. But in Europe, traditional model respect the security of employees. So employment is secured by requiring just cause to dismissal, and working conditions also secured. If there's no consent to change the working condition, employer cannot unilaterally change working conditions. But Japanese model is, I call it flexicurity model, the combination of flexibility and security. Employment is secured by the case law to require reasonable reason, just cause to dismiss employees. So this means a rigidity to adjusting the size of the regular employees. To compensate for that rigidity, Japanese Supreme Court introduced very unique rule called reasonable modification of work rules. Work rules apply to all employees in the workplace. And if employer modify the work rules reasonably, then such reasonably modified work rules apply to all employees, including those who opposed the modification. So this is against the basic principle of the contract. Contract can be modified with the consent. But here, in order to collectively adjust the working conditions, Japanese Supreme Court allowed the unilateral modification on the condition that such modification is regarded as reasonable. This is a very unique rule. So we have the combination of flexibility and security. Now, Japan's lifetime or long-term employment system is comprised of standard and non-standard employees. In 1990, 80% of the Japanese workforce are regarded as standard or core employees. At that time, in 1990, only 20% belong to the category of non-standard employees. So for employer have to adjust the size of the workforce in the economic downturn. As for the standard employees, it is difficult to dismiss regular workers, standard workers. Therefore, Japanese employers in the economic upturn, Japanese employers ordered overtime. Then you have an economic downturn, employer just reduce the number of overtime. So the long working hours is a kind of adjustment against the fluctuation of the economy. As for the non-standard employees, most of them are hired by fixed-term contracts. So fixed-term contract, for example, one-year contract will be terminated at the end of the agreed term. This termination is not dismissal. So those who have the fixed-term contract are not protected by the case law requirements requirements of just cause. So employer in the economic upturn, employer just renew the fixed-term contracts. So yellow rim will expand, and when economy goes down, employer just refuse to renew the fixed-term contracts. So yellow rim will shrink. So this yellow part surrounding the core workers supported the lifetime employment. So non-regular workers, non-standard employees are shock absorbers against economic fluctuation. So this is Japan's lifetime employment system. So here we have two problems. First one is very long working hours among standard employees. The second problem is less protected non-standard employees. So actually, Work Style Reform Act addressed to these two social issues. Now first, let me talk about the working hours revision. This is the average annual working hours. Until the middle of 1980s, Japanese working hours were very long. And we had a trade friction caused by the Japan's excessive export to the foreign countries, triggered social dumping criticism on Japan's long working hours. So Japanese government internationally promised to reduce long working hours to avoid social dumping criticism. So we modified the Labor Standards Act in 1987. And until then, maximum working hours under the Labor Standards Act was 48 hours per week. But this principle was modified and 40 hours per week became the legal standards. So as you see, we have a continuous decline of over time, total working hours. But here we have kind of a magic of statistics. Average working hours reduced because it included those of part-timers. This is just average number of full-time and part-time workers working hours. So we have a very rapid increase in part-timers. So when you have an average number of full and part-timers, it is natural to average number will decrease. So when you have a divided figure, this line represents the working hours among full-time workers. So it is still over 2000, very long. There's no decrease in working hours for full-time workers. This is a problem. So we had calls for strengthening overtime regulations. There are several reasons for this calls. The first one is, in the first session we discussed something, but men's long working hours have hindered women's participation and success in the workplace. Of course, we enacted equal employment of the opportunity law between men and women. But if female workers are given the same opportunity, most of the female workers bear the family responsibility. So it is impossible to work as long working hours as men. So this hinders the participation and successful career for female workers. And second and more direct impact for this current revision of the law is Dentsu case, which was revealed in 2016. This beautiful lady is Matsuri Takahashi. She's a graduate from Tokyo University and entered Dentsu. Dentsu is the most prestigious advertising agency. And many of the Tokyo University graduates wants to be an employee of Dentsu. Actually, my friend, Professor Morito, once had a temporary agreement to work for Dentsu. So it's a very popular company. But Miss Matsuri Takahashi was exhausted and depressed. Oh, sorry, depressed from overwork. And finally, she committed a suicide on Christmas Day in 2015. This is her first year in Dentsu. And in October next year, October 2016, her mother, this is her mother had a press conference to notify the public that her daughter's death was officially admitted as work-related accident. And this was the second suicide case from overwork at Dentsu and became a big social scandal. In January 2017, just 3 months later, the president of Dentsu resigned, taking responsibility for the recurrence of suicide from overwork. So you can imagine how this case had huge impact on the Japanese society. So 2018 revision of the Labor Standards Act introduced many modifications of the current regulation on working hours and paid annual leave. So because the time is limited, I'm not going into detail, but most important thing is maximum limitation on overtime. Until March 2019, of course, we had some regulations on the limit of overtime, but this is just the administrative guidance. So it has no legal binding effect. So from this April, we had a legally binding norms. So the base principle is 8 hours a day and 40 hours a week. So this is original maximum hours of working hours. But when labor representative and management conclude an agreement, they can exceed this 40 hours and 8 hours a day maximum. But over time, as for the overtime, we introduce a new limit, 45 hours per month and 160 hours per year. But if there's exceptional cases to meet extraordinary temporary needs, they can have a special clause to further exceed this maximum limit. But this is, again, here we introduce the absolute maximum. So 720 hours per year. Oops. And 80 hours per month averagely. So this is the first time for Japan to introduce the legally binding maximum overtime limits. When we compare this situation, I think the European Union and the United States has a very different system. In EU, they regulate the length of hours worked. 48 hours per week, including overtime, is a maximum. They cannot exceed this limit. However, in the United States, there's no regulation on the number of hours worked. What they require is to pay 50% premium for hours exceeding 40 work week. So only overtime premium regulation United States adopted. There's no limitation on the actual hours worked. Japan, of course, we have a directly regulated hours worked, 8 hours a day and 40 hours a week. However, when Japanese employer has a labor management agreement, then this limit can be, it can be possible to exceed this limit. And previously there was no limitation. But 2018 revision firstly set the upper legal limit on overtime, 18 hours per month and 720 hours per year. So this is a big change. So we located close to the US section, but thanks to the 2018 revision, our position moved toward the European regulations. So this is working hours. The second topic is the problem of less protected non-standard employees. Yes, in 1990, as I said, only 20% of the Japanese workers are non-standard employees, but recently the ratio increased to nearly 40% of the total workforce in Japan. So it's a big change. Not only the quantitative change has occurred, but also qualitative change we experienced. In 1990, the majority of non-standard employees were sideline workers, housewives or students who works as a part-timers. So they can rely on the husband income or parents' income. But now, non-standard employees have to rely on their own income gained from the non-regular, non-standard employment. So they rely on the income of non-standard employment. So they are now mainline workers, and the ratio is increased. So the situation, how to address those problems, is a very big social problems. And not only the instability of their status, but also working conditions is very inferior to those of standard employees. This is a comparison of wages of standard employees and non-standard employees. So in the beginning, around 19 or 20, there's little difference. But standard employees enjoy seniority-based wage increase. So around 50, their wages is doubled than non-standard employees. There's a huge gap between regular and non-regular workers. So the increase of non-standard employees, their employment is very unstable, and their working condition is much inferior to standard workers. So Japanese labor policy introduced various regulations to combat this situation. But I will just skip the explanation. And yes, this is my interpretation of the development of regulation on non-standard employees. Japan first started with non-discrimination approach by the 27 Part-Time Work Act revision. Firstly, we introduced the non-discrimination requirement regulations. If the full-timer and part-timers work is equal and their human resource management is equal and contract period is equally open-ended, then employer cannot discriminate against non-standard part-time workers. But the person who could be covered by this regulation is only 1.3% of all part-time workers in Japan. You know, non-discrimination approach is if the work is equal, then pay should be equal. This is a non-discriminatory approach. So standard workers' work is 100, and if non-standard standard workers' work is equally valued, 100, and pays 180, 180. So this is illegal discrimination. But the problem is most of the non-standard employees, their work is not equal to the regular workers. But the problem is the wage gap is too wide, too unacceptably wide compared to the difference of the work value. So for example, standard workers pays 100 and non-standard workers work is 180 but the pay is 50. Is this legal or not? Under the non-discrimination regulation, work is not equal. So there's no regulations. Only work is equal, then equal treatment requirement will have effect. So most of the Japanese workers' situation, non-standard workers' problem is here. But non-discrimination approach will not work effectively. So in 2012, we modified Labor Contract Acts and introduced a new regulation for fixed-term contract workers. So here we didn't require any equal prerequisite, just considering work content, human resource management, and other related situations, unreasonable discrimination should be prohibited. Sorry, unreasonable difference shall be prohibited. So like this, you know, standard workers' work shall be evaluated 100, and non-standard workers' work shall be evaluated 80. So work is not equal here. But if the pays gap is so large, 150, so this huge gap of payment, considering the work difference, shall be regarded as illegal. So this is very unique approach to rectify the unreasonable gap between regular and non-regular workers. So equal work is not required. Whether difference shall be deemed unreasonable or not, this is a more important criteria to apply our new rectifying policy. And 2014, Part-Time Work Act was also modified following the 2012 revision. We introduced, prohibition of unreasonable difference approach because non-discrimination approach was so ineffective. But so labor professors contest to abolish this approach. But Minister of Labor, they just started this non-discriminatory approach. So they wanted to maintain this approach. And they abolished the third requirement, equal contract period. So there are only two requirements. But again, only 2.1% of part-timers are covered by this regulation. So most of part-timers' protection shall be provided by this prohibition of unreasonable differences. Then, in 2016, Prime Minister Abe suddenly declared that we will introduce equal work, equal pay rule in the Japanese labor law. So equal work, equal rule is a typical case of the non-discrimination approach. In the past, from 2007, we thought this is not so effective to Japanese labor market, but Prime Minister Abe declared we will introduce equal pay, equal work. So we are very much surprised. But 2 months later, Cabinet Office issued another explanation what they wanted to do. When they revise the law text, we will not write equal work, equal pay doctrine, but the law text shall be written as follows. If there's a difference, employer must demonstrate reasonable grounds, otherwise such differences shall be regarded as unreasonable differences. So what they wanted to really do is belong to the latter category, prohibition of unreasonable difference. But here again, the promoter took the unique stance. Yes. Before that, let me explain why has this unique approach, prohibition of unreasonable difference, been adopted. In Japan, wages are not determined by simply work content or job, but considering other factors such as ages, length of service, ability to perform work, family structure, etc. And labor unions requested wage that could afford to support households. And seniority-based wage system meets such needs. And the Japanese constitution guarantees the right to engage in collective bargaining. So Japanese constitution take it for granted that working conditions shall be negotiated between employer and labor unions. And the constitution does not dictate the wage should be calculated in accordance with the work value. So Cabinet Office wanted to introduce the prohibition of difference without reasonable grounds. But when we require the employer to verify the reasonable ground in the Japanese wage system, our system is totally different from Western society's wage system. Usually, you pay the job value. So you have a job-based wage system. But Japanese very popular wage system is skill-based wage system. So if we adopt the equal work, equal pay rule, our traditional skill-based wage system might be changed into job-based wage system. Is that really a good thing or not? Wage gap between standard workers whose age is 50 with 30 years service, earning 35,000 yen, and standard workers age 20 with 2 years service, earning 200,000 yen. This is very common in the regular workers working at the factory. This is totally perfectly legal under the current Japanese skill-based wage system, even if both of them are engaged in the same job and subject to the same human resource management, because length of service is thought to represent workers' accumulated skill. Then, should the gap between standard workers and non-standard employees in the similar situation be prohibited? For example, age 50 regular workers' pay is 350,000 yen, and non-standard workers age 20 and only 2 years service, his earning is 200,000 yen. There's a huge gap. But if they are both regular workers, this is legal in Japan. But if the age 20s workers employment status non-standard employees, this might be prohibited by the revision of new law. But is it really understandable? If new rule requires employers to demonstrate reasonable grounds for the gap, might employers be de facto compelled to adopt job-based wage system? The reason why Japan maintains very, very low unemployment rate is we haven't adopted job-based wage system. In European countries, they adopted job-based wage system. So those who graduate from school, they have no skills to accept some, higher value job. So they remain unemployed. In Japan, graduates from school without any vocational training are hired without any training of vocational skills. Because of the skill-based wage system, employers take the responsibility to educate and train those young workers. Thanks to this wage system, Japanese young workers' unemployment is very, very low, around 5%. So if we move to job-based wage system, we might encounter the similar younger unemployment problems in the future. So in the cabinet, this kind of discussion occurred. So considering these issues, the difference of wage system between Japan and Western society, 2018 law finally settled in the traditional prohibition of unreasonable difference. So, the final outcome is unreasonable difference shall be prohibited. So, when in 2016, Prime Minister Abe declared equal work, equal pay rule shall be introduced in Japan, it turned into a kind of just a slogan to strengthen the regulation on non-standard employees. But of course, we have a problems. Problem of prohibition of unreasonable difference approach is poor foreseeability of unreasonableness. Equal work, equal pay. So the cabinet office adopted equal work, equal pay guidelines, which would have the foreseeability of unreasonableness examination. But in fact, the guidelines takes the non-discrimination approach. I mean, when rules determining wages of both standard and non-standard employees are equal, different treatment is prohibited. They gave many examples, but they only make it as a prerequisite for this rule. If the wage determination rules is equal, then different treatment is prohibited. Then what happened when wage rules are different between standard and non-standard employees? This guideline just repeats the legal text. Unreasonableness shall be determined considering work content, human resource management, and other relevant situations objectively. This guideline only added objectively. This is, of course, not, yes. So this guideline says nothing about the most important and difficult situations. So I think key to solve this very difficult problem is to look at the procedure to determine wage, such as determining wages, such as employers' explanation concerning the differences and negotiation with labor unions and majority representative employees. So we are still in the process of trial and error. Labor law reform have other agenda, the promotion of side jobs and multiple jobs, and protection of employment-like work style, introduction of multi-solution of unjust dismissals, and promotion of mobility in the labor market is a big change of the long-term employment system, and introduction of unskilled foreign labor into the Japanese labor market. So these are on the list of the agenda of labor law reform. But most important thing is missing, that is establishing the employees' representation system in the workplace. As I mentioned, the working conditions shall be established by the negotiation between labor and management. But union density, union organization rate is continuously decreased and now 17%. So only 4 out of 5 Japanese employees are covered by the labor union protection or labor collective bargaining agreement. So we need a different channel to collect the voice of non-student employees and diversified workforce. So some scholars, including myself, propose to introduce a works council system, which was adopted in Germany or other European countries. So I think the most important agenda for the future Japanese labor policy is introduction of employee representation system. Okay, I this is a picture I took with Professor Ninomiya. This is a statue just in front of this faculty building. So love and passion is very important for human
Yeah.
being, and for labor policy, love for human being and passion to to make the working life more beneficial is very important. So I put this picture. Obrigado pela atenção.
Professor, there is a secret history about this statue. May I tell you now? The city hall took this statue because it was considered indecent. So students went there in the city hall and took it back. Yes, it's a very famous history about our college here. Nowadays, maybe they don't take a look at when they are there, but it was accused to be indecent for many years. Well, Professor, we are in the process of trial and error here in Brazil for the last 75 years. Because this gender, this equal pay, equal wages, equal employment, we have in our labor law from 1943, CLT, and we still couldn't understand it. The labor reform in 2017 also talked about it, but we still have some doubts about it. But we have the job style, the, not what's the name? It's a job. The job based, yes, we have the job based wage. Yes, you have to pay the same wage for the young and for the old. We don't have the skill-based wage. This is also a problem for us. This the reverse problem you have there. And before Professor Freitas starts, I have a bad news for you concerning the unemployment rate. We have a very huge unemployment rate, but we don't consider the long time employees. Those who look for jobs for more than 2 years are out of the statistic. So we have 4 million long time unemployment out of the statistic because we consider them out of the market. They use an expression for me is very strange. They say they are disenchanted. They are out of market. I didn't realize it until 2 years ago. Now for me, not only for me is very shocking, but I can understand the unemployment rate in another way. So whenever you see a Brazilian unemployment rate, consider plus 4 million people that are long time unemployment people. This is not a good news, but it works as this. Well, Professor Freitas.
Just ask to change.
Yes, with him or for me? With him.
With him.
Okay.
Yes, because I have
No, here,
my
Professor.
presentation.
Oh, okay, okay. So, Professor Freitas, it's an honor to present you, my friend and my my colleague from the bad moments and the good moments here in the college. And I'm very glad that I'm here to present you and your general overview in Brazilian labor law reform. Thank you, Freitas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Very glad to be here. Unfortunately, trying to address a very challenging subject, which is the Brazilian labor and employment law reform. But first of all, I'd like to stress how delightful is to be with sharing once more a session with my dear colleague, Professor Takashi Araki, who is one of the most well-known authorities of the Japanese labor and employment law before the Western audience. So it's an honor, it's a pleasure once again to meet you, Professor. Well, talking about, Professor Romero Mateus already said, which labor reform are we going to address? This is the first question. So trying to focus the most recent Brazilian experience, I try to divide my presentation in four topics, 4 parts. But I must, first of all, justify why we move back to the subject of labor reform. We have already addressed this subject in the meeting of Matsumoto in 2018. Why we move back to this subject? Because it's motu perpetuo. It's a continuous. It's an ongoing process that must be carefully watched and continuously evaluated. Well, let me see here. As I told you, I split my presentation in 4 parts. Some general remarks about the nature and the purpose of legal changes, the ethical foundations of labor and employment law between the late 1940s and 1980s, the ethical foundations that support the 2017 labor reform, and finally, it's inevitable, we have to address the challenge for trying to draw some possible scenarios for the legal changes, considering the current administration, considering the current guy in the office and the current policy in terms of labor and employment law and in terms of fighting unemployment and addressing the continuous theme and subject of labor litigation in Brazil. The first question I think we have to offer is what sort of reasons should endorse the decision to reform the law and employment law, the labor and employment law. The first thing ordinarily comes to mind when one decides to perform a broad and deep change in the labor and employment law is the need for bridging the gap between an old and inefficient repertoire of legal dispositions and the demands emerging from the present or even from a predictable future social and economic environment. In other words, in a few words, moving forward to provide adequacy, efficiency, and enforceability to the labor relations system. These predicates, adequacy, efficiency, and enforceability, however, need to be put into a moral perspective. In other words, provided we consider changes for the legal system, we have to think about ethical standpoints. The instrumental tripod requires an ethical approach. But what is it for? To be able to achieve meaningful public policy outcomes. In other words, the outcomes must be evaluated, must be judged in relation with the ethical standpoints and in relation to the public policies that you intend to, that one intends to put in practice. A second other query. What used to be the ethical foundations of the labor and employment law until 1980s? Basically, we have the International Labor Organization's launching principles. Most of you are absolutely aware of it. It's not a novelty at all. To provide a better answer to this question, in retrospect, let me tell you something about the labor and employment law I studied this school during my early 1980s. The generation of my professors, Professor Takase Araki, most of them graduated during the Second World War period. No matter if ideologically conservative or progressive, labor or market biased, shared some core doctrinal principles and beliefs that supported the ethical foundations and the political goals of the labor and employment law. Some of the most highlighted in the course of my law school were International Labor Organization launching principles, such as no durable peace without social justice, and no fair competitiveness based upon labor exploitation. The main principle of the labor and employment law was the so-called, well-known principle of protection. And I must emphasize protection of worker, not protection of market. Either considering the vulnerability of the relation or taking into account the coessential asymmetry of the relationship between labor and employer. In other words, labor or employment relations is the ones in which the employer shall command and the employee has to obey. The well-known principle of subordination. This is what I learned here in the school. This is part of the ethos of my legal formation. And this was the main labor and employment law foundations until the beginning of the crisis, the decline of the welfare state in the Western countries. So, the reconstruction of the Western economies and political systems in the aftermath of the Second World War had been held by prevailing assumption that it would require an entire rebuild of the social contract. At that time, the paradigmatic social contract should at least bind workers' unions and employers' managers to a central and political and social settlement by which workers' leaders should renounce the revolutionary path and employers should accept the commitment to income distribution. This is very briefly summarizing the idea of the social contract of the welfare state experience. And this is very important for us. The core foundations of the welfare state was the political and social contract binding elites and unions consistent with the idea of strengthening the Western democracy before the Eastern communist menace during the Cold War times. As most of you certainly don't ignore, the welfare state deeply inspired the Western labor and employment law doctrines until most recently. To a certain extent, we can assume that the welfare state contract consists of a core political arrangement to provide legitimacy to the post-war Western democracies, in contrast to Eastern authoritarian communist regimes. In the backstage of the welfare state social scenario, we could meet some basic theoretical assumptions, such as, for example, the very well-known Karl Polanyi's central proposition. Labor, land, and money are essential elements of industry. But labor, land, and money are obviously not commodities. The postulate that anything that is bought and sold must have been produced for sale is emphatically untrue in regard to them. Labor is only another name for a human activity. Land is only another name for nature. Actual money, finally, is merely a token for purchasing power, which, as a rule, is not produced at all, but comes into being through the mechanism of banking, of state, and finance. None of them is produced to sale. The commodity description of labor, land, and money is entirely fictitious. This is a very well-known fragment of Karl Polanyi's The Great Transformation. Well, back to the opening queries. Now, let's try to summarize the ethos of labor reforms in Brazil nowadays. The first are answered. What are the main goals? What are the main purpose of the reform? To improve adequacy, efficiency, and enforceability again. Moving to the second of the query, adequacy, efficiency, and enforceability to update measures and strategies devoted to reinforcing what moral values? The protections of worker. Definitely, this is unfortunately not the purpose anymore. Protecting the worker is no longer the ethical parameter, nor the political goal for this reform whatsoever. I shall first confess that I have serious doubts in if we are facing really a new initiatives, new political goals. It seems to me, Professor Romero, that almost all the proposals are inspired on beliefs and dispositions that lead us back to the early 19th century labor and employment law. Just going back to the beginning of the labor and employment law doctrine and institutional building. The labor reforms of 2017 in Brazil, I think as well as, not exactly, but very close in the same direction that the Spanish labor reform, Italian and France and Portugal, just to give some examples in the Western countries, are no more trying to increase legal protection to workers. In a very different direction, these reforms accept to withdraw legal protections based on the general belief that labor rights erode competitiveness and discourage new job opportunities. They share with variable degrees of explicitness the pre-1929 liberal faith on the regulatory role of the market, even for labor, land, and money. The central assumption is based on the belief that labor rights are costs and employees are burdens, not assets. During our most recent meeting in Matsumoto, I tried to offer you a brief outline of the disposition introduced by the two legal experts in 2017. Just go back briefly to the content of this legal reform, just to remind you. Basically, prevailing enforceability for collective bargaining and agreement regulation over statutory dispositions. authorized individual labor contracts contrary to statutory dispositions for the employees whose wage reached more than $3.3 thousand monthly, which means I think the most important thing to stress is that for the first time we broke the regulatory system that used to be homogeneous. We have just one labor and employment law regime of protection. After 2017, we broke this homogeneity, and it opens the door for some other paths of regression and misprotection. And we also introduced mandatory arbitration, which I think is possibly something interesting. Not as a sort of a way to avoid the courts, but I think arbitration, I'm not sure exactly if mandatory arbitration for labor relations, but anyway, arbitration is not necessarily something bad or good, depends. And the reform, unfortunately, missed the opportunity to define some preconditions, some requirements to use the arbitration, to implement arbitration under a more predictable standard. I mean, I think about how to train, how to teach the arbitrators, how to produce a healthy environment for this practice, and how to a certain extent, establish pattern of accountability for the arbitrators. And also, which is not irrelevant at all, introduced the intermittent employment relation, which is very close to the zero-hour contract from the British experience in the United Kingdom, and if I'm not wrong, Ireland also. They adopted the zero-hour contract. It's not like exactly the same, but it works very close to this process. So we can summarize these changes of 2017 as a movement from a state, statutory, and homogeneous pattern of labor protection to a market, contractual, and diversified one. Not exactly protection anymore, but regulation. By the time the labor reform was presented as a sort of panacea for millions of unemployed Brazilian workers, as well as a strong measure to reduce the huge rate of litigation in labor courts, seen by the employers as an important source of legal uncertainty. Employers were complaining for the uncertainty for the labor courts and the outcomes of the labor courts. So, considering the economically active population, about 88.9 million workers, the unemployment rate had just jumped from 6.6 million unemployment workers in February 2014 up to 14.2 million in the same period of 2017, plus the 4 millions, plus the 4 millions disenchanted. Yes, because statistics in unemployment it's sort of a conventional. They rate only the workers that are searching for employment. If they are not searching for employment anymore, they are not in this statistic. They put it aside. Considering the labor litigation rates measured by the number of new lawsuits filed, the Brazilian labor courts ended the year 2016 with 4 million, Professor Haraki, 4,2062,444. It's 14.5% of the whole rate of litigation of the judiciary as a whole. The unemployment rates remain in 2019 very close to the precedent scenario. 12.8 of the EAP, and the judicial litigation doesn't show the expected reduction to endorse the perception that the reform was efficient to address the employer's demand for legal certainty. 3,460,000 of new lawsuits filed, which now decreased a bit in the whole rate of litigation, decreased to 12.3%, the labor litigation in comparison to the whole litigation rates in Brazil. That is to say, the main outstanding promises of 2017 labor reform, such as to reduce unemployment and to improve legal certainty by diminishing the role of labor courts and reducing workers' rights, turn out to exhibit, according to statistical evidence so far, lack of adequacy, efficiency, and enforceability, despite its radical movement towards flexibilization, Professor Araki. Well, now face the scenario of the legal changes considering the current administration, basically. By supporting the standards of economic liberalism in association with a huge variety of regressive measures of populist political strategies of communications, the current administration that took the office by the democratic election last year still seems to have a few tangible proposals in the field of labor and industrial relations, despite the assertiveness of the men in the office. In spite of the fact of being democratically elected, the administration so far often and openly seems to deplore the centrality of the role of political mediation and check and balance institutions, typical to contemporary democracy, played by autonomous institutions. Using symbolic and political attitudes, repeatedly try to bypass the role of unions, political parties, universities, researchers, research think tanks, even mass media press, bar association, NGOs, and even upper courts. Twitter and Facebook became the main vehicles for communication between the central government and the citizens. The critics and the skeptical are treated as Brazilian enemies, outsiders of the patriotic circles of the leaders, friends, and the family members. The country has been politically divided since the impeachment of Mrs. Rousseff in the late 2016, but the current administration seemed to reconsider a normal scenario of political debate. Instead of working towards conciliation, central authorities keep insistently using the rhetoric of hostility and confrontation. Specifically, in the field of labor and industrial relations, the administration showed no attention for the ILO, for International Labor Organization, legal standards and core principles, such as promoting social dialogue and decent work so far. Through different gestures and initiatives such as the recent decree, Medida Provisória 881, the central government looks like being intentionally devoted to erode the legitimacy of labor and employment law, alongside other fields of human rights, such as migrant rights, gender diversity rights, indigenous native Brazilian safety and traditional rights and lands. Mr. Bolsonaro, for instance, has solemnly declared that during his term, this is literally his statement, during his term, there will be no further designation of territory for indigenous native Brazilians. Despite the ILO, the International Labor Organization Convention 169, ratified by Brazilian Congress in 2002, proclaiming that it's supposed to have adequate penalties shall be established by law for authorized intrusion upon or use of the lands of the people concerned, and governments shall take measures to prevent such offenses, Article 18 of the Convention ratified by Brazil. Besides the Sustainable Development United Nations goals for 2013, very important, very well known. Besides, I have been absent in the Brazilian public authority statement. Let me remind that this does matter for labor and employment law, my fellows, to the extent that many items of the ILO Decent Work Agenda are shared by the United Nations 2013 Sustainable Development Goals. They're just about the same. This is the way to try to summarize some of the reasons of my apprehension about the current moment of our labor and employment law. But most recently, on September 4th, a couple of days ago, the Ministry of Economy, we don't have more Ministry of Labor because the Ministry of Labor that was 87-year-old was extinguished and was absorbed by the Ministry of Economy. So the Ministry of Economy constitutes a so-called High Committee for Studies on Labor Issues, in charge to produce within 90 days a final report with proposals for the ministry. There is nothing explicit about the nature, the subject, and the purpose of the mentioned proposals. Among its members, I must say, and I'm very
Worried?
no, worry, not at all. No, among them we have Professor Nelson Mahish. We have Professor. Yes, we have a lot of very respected, very dignified members of the academy, but unfortunately we don't have just one union leader. We don't have one employer leadership. So this is worrying because this is a technical approach of a very huge and urgent political agenda. Well, I think we have to give them a chance to give us back something more, some food for thought. Just as a final remarks, I think we're going just to yes. A couple minutes more.
Yes.
So, fellows, democracy is a perishable device. Furthermore, we need to look attentively to the very evidence that the most recent threats to contemporary democracy ends up on the aftermath of legitimate elections. This is how to emphasize the central point of my presentation today. Labor and employment law rely upon democratic stability. As ILO repeatedly proclaims, and I agree, labor and employment law requires commitment to social dialogue to flourish and to become adequate, efficient, and enforceable for the protections of workers' dignity. No matter if progressive or conservative perspective will support, no matter, the 20th century history is plenty of evidence that there is no room for workers' dignity, and furthermore, there is no room for human dignity outside democracy and the rule of law. This is what I thought that what should be my contribution for the reflection of the challenging moment that we are facing here in Brazil. Thanks for having me.
Professor Araki, come back so that we can exchange some views. I think we have time for some questions. I'd like to invite you to make some questions to Professor Araki. No questions. Or Professor Freitas. I have a question to Professor Araki, but are you sure that you don't have any questions? Professor Araki, I'd like you to tell us a little bit more about the labor court in Japan. I explained the reason of my question. There is a myth in Brazil that there is no land with labor court except Brazil. Labor court in Brazil is almost 100 years or 70 years, and there are always news that they're going to extinguish because there's no need, because there is no room, and no country has this experience. They say that civil courts are enough to resolve the social disputes. Well, you know that as I am also a judge, and there's no relation. My question about my employment. Maybe I will be on employment in 2020 or 2021. The thing is that every time we discuss this in Brazil, they say that there is no other model as in Brazil with the labor court. When I was there in Japan, you explained me that you used to have the local court, the civil court, until 2003 or 2006, and then the labor section was necessary. It was very important to be created because the civil judges were not. They were maybe with too many labor questions to resolve. I'd like you to highlight some experience about this. And before, I'd like to say when you were shocked with Freitas' statistics about 4 million and 3 million new cases a year, but you have to bear in mind two things. First of all, there is a complete absence of other spaces of social dialogue in Brazil. We don't have strong unions, we don't have strong NGOs, or we don't have the IDRs developed. So as a judge, I also have small things to do, such as documents and papers, not only money. And second thing, 7 out of 10 workers who go to labor justice, they succeed, but they don't receive the money because the enterprises succeeded to run away. They forge a bankruptcy, they put money in the name of the third people. So this statistic must be tempered with the effectiveness. We are not effective in charging them. 7 out of 10 will succeed but not receive the money. So we failed in both ways because we have the model of labor court. We are not very popular. And then so I think there is a social way of approaching it without many respect of the sentence and so on. Well, let me hear you about the labor court in Japan.
Thank you very much, Professor. It's very important questions. First, why we introduced the tripartite labor tribunal system in 2006. And actually, in 2010, I gave a visit to labor court in Sao Paulo. I posed many questions. You abolished tripartite labor court system. And the answer is, labor side always support labor. And management lay judge always support management. So there's no use to listen to the expertise of the lay judges. In Japan, the situation is totally different. According to our hearing, almost all cases, the tripartite bench has a consensus. So sometimes labor lay judge support employer's allegation. And sometimes employer said, in this case, employer should win. So our labor tribunal lay judges, they really functioning as a neutral bench. This is one important success of our system. And of course, we have a civil court system, and we have many litigation on labor litigation. And our court system is very much respected among Japanese nationals. but the problem is they are too much precise. They respect precise justice. They spend too much energy, too much time to 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 make a 100% perfect judgment. So, but this tripartite labor tribunal system changed the way of thinking. What is needed? They need more expedited, early, speedy procedures. If they can get 100% outcome 2 years later, that's not good for the workers. So very speedy and give more access to the ordinary workers is very important. If we have to spend 14 months to hire, lawyers, it's not good for the ordinary workers. But when you spend only 70 days to get a final answer from the labor tribunal court, it is very attractive for ordinary workers. So that's why we introduced this system. And actually, professional judges very much highly evaluated the contribution of lay judges. Professional judge, in Japan, from the beginning of their career, professional judges start as a judge. So they have no practice experience. So what is going on in the negotiation of labor and employer? And whether this treatment should be regarded as a very exceptional treatment among the common sense of the labor and management. This kind of common sense they don't have. Professional judges do not have. So lay judges will provide. This is very exceptional treatment. So there might be some other reasons or something like that. They advise the professional judges. So each other they can give legal expertise and expertise in the labor relations. So they can work together cooperatively. That is the success of our system. Yeah.
When the worker or the employer are not don't agree with the sentence, they have an appeal, but not to the labor court, to the civil court. Am I right?
You are right. If the parties are not satisfied with the outcome of the tribunal judgment, they can appeal to the civil court. When they file the civil court, the arbitration this award becomes null and void. Yeah.
Yes. In Brazil, as I think you understood, that we have also a labor appeal court, and then as a superior court, also labor court. That's I think was a difference as far as I understood. You have the first degree and then the second degree directly in the civil court. Well, Freitas would like to tell, and Daniel would like to give you us some remarks. Well, I would like to thank again Professor Araki and Professor Freitas for this special session 2 and general overview of labor law reform. After the lunch, we will have some roundtable presentations, so I think Daniel has some special advices for the audience. I think this is this one here.
It's better.
Thank you, Professor Romero, Professor Araki, Professor Freitas. Thank you very much for your presentations. Next, we'll take a lunch break until 2 o'clock. From 2 o'clock to 3:30, we'll have 4 simultaneous panels happening in different classrooms. All classrooms are on the second floor, this floor. Group 1 will be at room João Monteiro, Group 2 at room Alcântara Machado, Group 3 at room 2, the room over there, next to this room, and Group 4 at room 3, also over there. Please check the signs outside when you come back from lunch. And before you go, Professor, the organization committee would like to extend an invitation to join us for the São Paulo Symphony Orchestra from 6 o'clock tonight. It will be like, what was the room? Sala Nobre, like the main hall here. The São Paulo Symphony Orchestra will be playing Beethoven and Stravinsky. If you're interested, please go there after like the seminar. That's it. Thank you. Sorry, like we would like to take a picture. So if you can join, like here in the front.
E aí estou aproveitando aqui o.
Please.
Pessoal, uma foto aqui, por favor. Yuri pede uma foto. Organizar-se para uma foto. A picture, please. Let's prepare here.
Deixa eu te sugerir uma coisa. Vocês sentam